story of Joseph covers 12 chapters in Genesis, and chapter 45 turns out to be the grand climax. I've long considered Joseph's tale to be one of the most dramatic and inspiring stories, not just in the Bible, but in all of literature. In some ways, it's a tragedy, but a tragedy that resolves in a reunion and a restoration. As we've noted already in our studies in Genesis, the Bible is rather unflattering in the stories of its main characters, its heroes. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they've all been shown as they say warts and all. But Joseph, he comes off rather differently in the story. But the only negative thing the narrative says of him is his, immature sharing of his dreams with what he ought to have known were envious brothers, and how that would only inspire more jealousy. But other than that, Joseph is presented as an example of perfect faith and stellar virtue. Maybe he's cast that way because he's an amazing picture of Jesus. Well, the story has reached its climax now. His brothers have come to Egypt a second time to get supplies for their famine-plagued home. And Joseph's arranged a clever scheme to determine if his brothers feel the same way about his younger brother Benjamin that they had about him. Will they take the opportunity to ditch Benjamin when it arises so that they can get their hands on the coveted birthright? Chapter 44 ends with the brothers proving they are in truth not the men they were some now 35 years before when they sold Joseph into slavery. Their regret over that and concern for what the loss of Benjamin would do to their dad conspired to move them to protect Benjamin at the peril of their own lives. That's all Joseph needed to know, that it was now time to end the charade and reveal himself to his brothers. And so we read in verse 1. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go from me!" So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. As the prime minister of Egypt, Joseph had a raft of assistants that he tells to leave. Verse 2. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Now it seems as we read the story that Joseph and Pharaoh had grown close. Pharaoh seemingly knew Joseph's story and what an emotional moment that this would be for him. Verse 3. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. Well, I guess so. Imagine how stunned they had to be. Joseph's alive? And he's that guy? Prime Minister of the world's mightiest realm? Uh-oh. What's he going to do now that the tables have turned? You know, if Hollywood was in charge of the script, Joseph would be wearing a black t-shirt with a skull on it, a bandolier of shotgun shells over his chest, a thick belt holding a wicked foot-long hunting knife and grenades. Probably has a riot shotgun in one hand and a Glock in the other. The Punisher. And it's time for him to get even with his brothers who literally have sold him out. But that's not the route that Joseph takes. Verse 4. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." And so they came near. Reluctantly, hesitantly, of course. You see, suddenly they were all very polite to each other. "You first. No, you. I insist." And then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." He's already told them that it was he, but the look on their faces means they're incredulous. And so he repeats, "It's really me, guys. And let me prove it by mentioning something only the real Joseph would know. You guys sold me into slavery." But he doesn't want them to think that he holds that against them. And so he quickly adds, verse 5, "But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all of his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." Now, friends, there is so much here. What I want to focus on is something that Joseph says that can bring us into the amazing forgiveness that he demonstrates. Joseph acknowledged that his brothers sinned in what they had done to him all those years before. In verse 5, he said, "You sold me here." That was just the start of his years of abuse and mistreatment. He became a slave, then a convict, though he had committed no crime. For 13 years, he suffered terrible injustice, but those years of abuse did not embitter him. As we've been seeing, Joseph trusted that God was doing something, though he couldn't see what it was. But now, as the prime minister who's prepared Egypt for a brutal famine, he saw what it was. And he shares that perspective with his brothers when he says, "God sent me before you to preserve life." What they did was wrong. It was a grievous sin. They sold Joseph to Egypt, but God had sent him on a mission there. They made a slave of their brother while God made him a ruler. They sinned, but God is bigger than sin. He's not limited by it. He's able to take our foolishness and bring good out of it. We have a verse for that, Romans 8:28, which says, "We know all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose." Now, many people know that verse. It's a favorite. But what many don't realize is that the next verse is a crucial part of it, and it gets to the heart of what Joseph says here. In verses 28 and 29, we read this. "Now we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose." What that purpose is in what we find next. Here's the good that all things are working toward. Verse 29, "For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of a son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren." Joseph didn't excuse his brother's sin. He didn't wave it away or say that it didn't matter. He instead put it into God's hands and let God edit it, alter its results. Joseph decided that rather than being the victim in his brother's story, he'd be the victor in God's. Instead of forever looking back at what they did and all the trouble that it caused, all he missed out on as the favored son in the father's house, Joseph looked forward by faith, trusting that God was doing something important. It was those 2 dreams that he had had when he was 17 that planted that in his heart and centered him in his confidence in God. In chapter 37, Joseph had 2 dreams he knew were prophetic. In both of them, he saw his family bowing to him, and that he had 2 different dreams with the same meaning meant that God was affirming that it would come to pass. Just as Pharaoh's 2 dreams affirmed that there would be 7 years of bounty followed by 7 more of famine. Christian, please hear this. You also have a glorious destiny. You don't need a dream of it, for you already have something better by far, God's word, his promise. The Bible beats a dream any day. So here's God's promise to you. He is working all things together for good for you. And the good that it's all working toward is that you are being conformed to the image of Christ. And what God begins, he always completes. And that's why in Philippians 1:6 we find this. We are confident in this, that he who has begun a good work in us will keep it until it's complete in the day of Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, we have this promise. "Eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love him." As for Joseph's dreams of greatness when his brothers would bow to him, listen to this promise that God made in Revelation chapter 20, verse 6. "During the millennium, we shall reign with Christ." Like Joseph, we too are destined for a throne. We don't need a dream of it because we have God's promise on it. I've done a fair bit of pastoral care with people one-on-one over the years. People want to talk about all sorts of things that are troubling them. They want advice, guidance. We take them to God's word, looking to see how its wisdom can assist them. One of the things that we've noticed is how often the problem of unforgiveness comes up. Something has happened, and instead of people letting it go, they hold on to their anger and their desire to get even. They've been hurt, and they want the one who hurt them to hurt back. Now, most of these people are Christians who know that they ought to forgive, God commands them to. But they have spent so many months and sometimes years feeling justified in holding a grudge, they're stuck. I suspect that someone watching this is in the same place, stuck. Something's happened to you, maybe in your distant past, and it wounded you deeply. Instead of forgiving those who sinned against you, you've built your identity around that wound. Is what happened to you worse than what happened to Joseph? Were you thrown into a pit in some deserted place, assuming you were going to be left there to die? Did you then listen to those who were supposed to be closest to and most loving of you decide instead to sell you to strangers? Were you trafficked to a foreign country and used as a slave? Were you falsely accused of a serious crime so that you ended up in a prison for a decade? Sadly, such things do happen in this sin-sick and twisted world. But I'm going to venture a guess that the vast majority of those watching this haven't been through that kind of hell. Joseph was, and he forgave. He was able to because he trusted God was doing something. He refused to let the sin of others hijack his vision. He kept his eyes on and his hope in God. The practical outworking of that trust was that instead of sitting around moaning about what a raw deal he had, he went to work serving where he could. And that, his faithful service, is what God was doing in the 20 or so years before he ascended Egypt's throne. God didn't just put Joe where he needed to be to make connections that would raise him to be the prime minister. There was a lot more going on than that. Joseph also learned the skills that he would need as the ruler of millions of people. His training started all the way back home when his father started grooming him to inherit the estate. In Potiphar's house, Joseph learned the Egyptian language, culture, and their system. The prison that he was kept in was a political prison, and so he was learning the ins and outs of the various factions at court. His home in Canaan was elementary school. High school was Potiphar's house. Prison was college. And graduation came when he stood before Pharaoh for his final. Joseph's years in the school of hard knocks was all for a good and divine purpose. His story is parallel to ours. Just as he was destined for the throne of Egypt, you and I are destined in Christ for an even greater throne, to rule and reign with him for 1,000 years. And this life now is our school. Like Joseph, we ought to be concerned with one thing, being faithful to learn the lessons, not wigged out by the circumstances. God isn't just interested in getting you into heaven in the sweet by and by. He wants to get heaven into you in the here and now. The great goal of your existence isn't just to go to heaven one day. It's to become someone worthy of heaven through the ongoing work of God's Spirit as he molds and shapes you by his grace and in his truth. Joseph forgave his brothers, not just because he worked himself up to be magnanimous. His forgiveness was the overflow and fruit of his trust in God. How could he be unforgiving and at the same time say that God was doing something? Let's be honest. Unforgiveness at its root is a lack of trust in God. It's saying that his promise to work all things to a glorious good doesn't apply in our case or in this situation. Friend, if you're stuck, if bitterness and unforgiveness grip your heart and your mind, leave off trying to forgive simply by willing it to be so. Instead, do what Joseph did. Trust that God is able not only to forgive sin, but able to edit its results so that they work for good. Don't look back, reliving and replaying the offense. Look forward to what God will do as you put yourself into his hands. Verse 9, hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children, your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine. So there are 5 years yet to go in the famine. Jacob's extensive flocks would not survive in Canaan, and so Joseph urged his brothers to return home, gather up all they had, and relocate to Goshen, which is the delta region of Egypt, where he would make sure that they were provided for. Think about how difficult it would be for the brothers when they got home. They'd have to admit to their father what they had done years before, that they had sold Joseph into slavery. Verse 12. And behold, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. So you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt and all that you have seen, and you shall hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. Moreover, he kissed all of his brothers and wept over them, and after that his brothers talked with him. Now the report of it was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brothers have come. And so it pleased Pharaoh and his servants well. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your animals and depart, go to the land of Canaan, bring your father and your households, and come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Now you are commanded, do this, take carts out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and your wives, bring your father and come. Also, do not be concerned about your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Again, we see that the relationship between Pharaoh and Joseph was pretty tight. He was stoked at their family being whole again. He sent moving vans, if you will, back with the brothers to assist in the move. Verse 21. Then the sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them carts, according to the command of Pharaoh, and he gave them provisions for the journey. He gave to all of them, to each man, changes of garments, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garment. And he sent to his father these things, 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and food for his father for the journey. So he sent his brothers away, and they departed, and he said to them, see that you do not become troubled along the way. Literally, don't quarrel, don't get angry with each other on the way home. Joseph didn't want them getting suspicious and thinking that he had some ulterior motives going on. That all of this was just a setup to get even with them eventually. He's just anxious to see them all back together as a family in a place where they can thrive. Verse 25. Then they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan, to Jacob their father, and they told him, saying, Joseph is still alive, and he's governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart stood still because he did not believe them. Have you ever had news that seemed too good to be true? I mean, you wanted to believe it, but you hesitated for fear that you were being set up? That's Jacob. He's figured the boys must be mistaken. It was obvious they believed Joseph was alive and well, but surely they had to be mistaken. Verse 27. But when they told him all the words which Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. So note the change of names here. Jacob only believed when he saw, but then Israel said, it's enough, Joseph lives. You see, Jacob was a carnal man who would only believe what his eyes told him, but Israel was the spiritual man who by faith knew that he'd see his son again. Joseph is an amazing picture of Jesus. Here at the end of chapter 45, we see how the brothers speak of us as followers of Jesus. They went home after discovering who Joseph was, and he'd blessed them. Then they told Jacob all his words and shared his blessing. The way others will know that Jesus is alive is when we share his message and show his blessing.